FHI underscore.
That's it?
Yep.
I got your name spelled right?
That's right.
Okay.
For their presentation today with all of you. So if you want to go to their notes, it's an open Google document. Just go to bit.ly/DukeHP right there.
Oh, and then I've got to actually include the hashtag DukeHP in here.
Press the button, press the button. I don't want to have to type that in.
Open this
Talk
Yeah.
today at, let's just say, let's give her a presentation. I'll just call it an open discussion. Today hosted by, there we go.
Reality changing before our very eyes.
Case sensitive, right? Okay, you guys ready? You want to start?
Sure. I'm seeing some people are saying that there's not sound yet, but is there anything that we need to do?
Let me go check with Hannah. There should be sound now.
Yep.
Okay.
She said there is. Thank you.
Sure. Okay, so hi everyone for coming. Today my name is Adeline Cohen. I'm a visiting faculty fellow here at FHI, and I'm working with the Games Lab, the Greater Than Games Lab, and with Victoria over there. And this is an event that the Greater Than Games Lab is sponsoring along with the Duke PhD Lab, and I'm really proud to present my two friends over there, Pete Roriba and Jesse Stommel. And I'm going to give you a little introduction about their biographies, and then we're going to start. So Jesse Stommel is Director of the English and Digital Humanities at Marylhurst University. Dr. Stommel's work runs the gamut from haptic media to virtual Shakespeare to horror film. He presents and publishes regularly on film theory, body horror, new media, and digital pedagogy. His courses radically re-envision how we think about and produce media by emphasizing new forms of mass collaboration. He is pioneering approaches to student interactions in digital spaces. He received his PhD from the English department at the University of Colorado Boulder, where he also taught for 10 years in the departments of film, writing, and rhetoric and English. From 2010 to 2011, he was a Marion L. Britton postdoctoral fellow at the Georgia Institute of Technology. His essay, Towards a Zombie Pedagogy, Embodied Teaching and the Student 2.0, is included in Zombies in the Academy, Living Death in Higher Education, forthcoming in 2013 from Intellect Press. He is co-founder, designer, and managing editor of Hybrid Pedagogy, a digital journal of teaching and technology. Pete Roriba is a visiting lecturer at Georgia State University in Atlanta, where he completed both his PhD in American Fiction and Red Comp and his Master's in English Education. He teaches rhetoric and composition classes at Georgia State University, but also has experience teaching literary survey and analysis classes. Pete's dissertation focused on the post-secular sermons in contemporary American novels and reflects his curiosity about the effects of postmodernity on the rhetoric of religious institutions and individual spirituality. His classes are technologically engaged, harnessing his interest in social media, the digital humanities, and the strength of organic writing and editing in digital spaces. He co-edits Hybrid Pedagogy, which launched in January 2012. This year, Pete designed his department's new media literacy pilot program, a year-long alternative to the standard English 1101 curriculum, focused on developing new media literacy and composition skills and building a robust pedagogical mentoring community. He has also been involved in the mentoring work of the Iraq University Linkages program at Georgia State, funding by a grant from IREX. All right, take it away, guys.
So I think today we're going to hopefully open it up into a really free and raucous, we hope, discussion with all of you. So we're going to try and keep our presentation at the beginning as short as possible so that we can really try and engage you for the majority of our time here. I'm going to start by just reading the description of the event, just to kind of set the stage for what you're doing, and I may riff off of what we've got here a little bit. This summer, hybrid pedagogy, and just so if you're following along on the Google Doc, we've tried to make everything a link here so that if you want to pull up any of these examples, you can as we're talking. This summer, hybrid pedagogy ran the experimental course MOOC, a mini MOOC, a meta MOOC, a MOOC about MOOCs. The course was announced in the hybrid pedagogy article, The March of the MOOCs, Monstrous Open Online Courses, in which Jesse, that's me, argues content and learning are two separate things, often at odds. Most content is finite and contained, whereas learning is chaotic and indeterminate. It's relatively easy to create technological infrastructures to deliver content, harder to build relationships and learning communities to help mediate, inflect, and disrupt that content. While institutions ponder how to make excursions into new media more efficient and profitable, the pedagogues at the digital table must push the other side of the envelope. We should be creating critical and reflective sandboxes that invite learners to set their own goals, make mistakes, collaborate, and improvise. One of the projects of hybrid pedagogy, the journal that we co-edited, from its start was to take a meta look, not just at MOOCs, but to sort of take a meta look at almost everything. So almost everything that the journal has done from the very beginning, we have both analyzed the thing and then analyzed us analyzing the thing and talked about these various different layers of what we're doing, because we always want to think not only about technology, but how we're thinking about and using technology. Not to take technology as a sort of a must-have, not to have this shiny, glittery view of technology, but to always be taking a very critical, thoughtful, interrogative role towards technology. In Deep Play, Diane Ackerman writes, "We may think of play as optional, a casual activity, but play is fundamental to evolution." George Dennison offers a similar account of play in The Lives of Children, in which he describes children's natural play as expansive and diverse, alternately intense and gay, whereas more formal play, games with umpires, rules, etc., becomes strained and silent, serious, and uncomfortable. One of the things that Pete and I both try to do in our teaching is try to engage our students as players in a game, and we are equal players with them. So we try not to be the umpires of the game, but we try and be right in the game, right in the fray with them. And that's what we've tried to do with MOOC, and that's what we've also tried to do in the experiment that we're about to tell you about today. An attachment to outcomes discourages experimentation. In organic writing and digital media, Seeds and Organs, Pete argues that process takes precedence over the product. This talk will emphasize the ways that play can function not as a methodological approach toward a set of outcomes, but as the outcome in and of itself. We will open a conversation about how social media and digital space make learning voracious and lively by inviting new and often wild modes of interaction.
To transition that, I'll say that in preparing for our talk, we decided that it made the most sense to actually make a game that we could talk about in the context of this conversation. So using the interactions that we saw inside of MOOC, we talked for several days about constructing a game that would engage people, that would have a particular kind of organic curriculum attached to it. And so what we came up with is the game that Jess is going to show to you now, Twitter versus Zombies. So Twitter versus Zombies launched on Friday afternoon. We promoted it all through last week through lots of different kind of professional and pedagogical channels that we have. And we kind of pragmatically set the game up to begin as we finished our presentation at SAMLA on Friday and end half an hour before this presentation today. So
the counter was literally running down just as you were all grabbing your lunches. We're watching the 30 seconds and the game was ending just as we began.
But it's important for us in the beginning to assert that that Twitter versus Zombies is a case study that allows us to think about our approaches to all the other projects that we've been involved in for the last year, which is our journal, Hybrid Pedagogy, the MOOC that we ran in August, and several other kind of ancillary projects that we've had going on afterwards. So I'm going to talk very briefly about how Twitter versus Zombies work, and then we're going to start kind of outlining very briefly how we felt like we learned certain design principles in the making of Twitter versus Zombies that we think are going to be pedagogically useful moving forward. Basically, Twitter versus Zombies was a really simple version, or a digital version of this game that's kind of going across college campuses right now called Humans versus Zombies. Has anyone heard of this? You played City? Okay, one. So in Humans versus Zombies, you basically just have a bunch of people who are put into a database. They all begin as humans, and they have to identify themselves by an armband that they get when they enter the game, and then there's one zombie that begins tagging other people, and then as the week goes on, people have to move their headbands from their arms to their heads, and then the database of humans starts to dwindle, and the zombies are enormous, and eventually you have just hordes of people waiting outside of buildings where they know humans who've dodged zombies all week are. And we've got a link, and one of our documents, we've got a link to the Humans versus Zombies page because that was a big inspiration. So in adapting that to Twitter, we tried to make the simplest kind of framework in the beginning where we came up with 3 rules. You registered for the game, you were immediately a human in the game, and when the game began, you could write tweets using the hashtag for the game, which was TVSZ, and you had basically 3 action tags that you could use. One was bite if you were a zombie. And then if you were a human, you could either dodge a bite with the hashtag dodge command or swipe, protecting another human. And zombies could only bite once every 30 minutes, and humans could only dodge or swipe once an hour. So you had a limited amount of those actions. And so as we began the game, we took the Twitter bot that Jesse uses for DigiRhino, which is the duck, that's Digi, who's getting bitten by the rat there. And
Digi the duck is a mascot for Digital Writing Month, which is an event that I'm putting on through my organization. The English and Digital Humanities program at Maryhurst is running Digital Writing Month this month, and Digi the duck is the mascot. So he became patient 0 for our Twitters versus Zombies game. And the beginning of the game, he ran around chomping at people's ankles like a good duck would. And it actually took a good 30 minutes to an hour before he got the first victim.
Because people kept protecting each other. But as they ran out of protections, then Digi turned his first zombie, and very slowly through that next 3 or 4 hours, zombie population started to grow. The most important component of this, and we'll get to this in the design principles, is that everyone participating in the game, it had to be scalable so that we could imagine being able to play it with a couple of people or a bunch of people. So it had to be self-legislating. So we had to explain from the beginning how you interacted with the game so that you weren't always reaching out for a referee or an umpire or somebody to tell you what had happened to you. You were in charge of your own kind of identity. If a zombie bit you and it was a legitimate bite and nobody saved you, you had to go onto the chart and change your status. And it's funny looking at this because in the first 24 hours of the game, there were very few zombies, but we just hit this tipping point where they were legion. So we can answer more questions about how the game worked. As the game progressed, we instituted challenges. So participants and the players in the game had to write blog posts about the game to kind of construct a narrative of the game. They had to take pictures of weapons that they were going to use. They were able to earn, humans were able to earn kind of safe zones, and zombies were able to have extra bites, able to earn extra bites. And all of that concluded just half an hour ago. But bringing it back to kind of looking at the game from a pedagogical perspective, we want to talk about what we felt like were the 6 most important design principles of the game. And I think Jesse's going to talk about the first one.
So one thing that we wanted this game both to be a sort of a sandbox for us to play in and experiment with some of these ideas. What we really wanted to do is take all the things that we had done in MOOC and all the experiments we had run in MOOC and try and create a little small nugget version, what I call a micro MOOC. So the tiniest little version, just a single activity that is massive and that is essentially attempting to teach or encourage learning of a particular activity. And so the goal was to teach, we decided the goal was to teach Twitter literacy. And really what Twitter literacy meant evolved as the game went along, as we watched people's skills grow, and we realized we could add more and more complex aspects to the game. So people started just playing around with hashtags, then they learned how to use @mentions, and we'll talk a little bit more about the various things they learned. But thinking about the design principles, going into this game, how do we want people to get these skills? First design principle, improvisation within a framework. And I really want to give some kudos to SLAM teacher, whose name is Sean Michael Morris, for helping flesh out this idea with us. He was one of the co-designers on MOOC, and has also been the sort of head honcho of DigiRimo, which inspired the Twitter versus Zombies game. So the idea is that you create a loose and simple framework that people can really play within. So you have rules that might seem somewhat restrictive, but they're simple enough that people can improvise from those rules, and people can create their own sort of experiments within those rules. Create a little box and then let people loose. It's sort of like a playground, a kid's playground. You give them boundaries. You say you can go out to that fence, you can't go past that, but sort of what you do within the space is up to you. And so if you have sort of a framework that's simple enough, it allows people to improvise within it. MOOC, we did the same thing. The goal was to essentially allow the course and what happened within the course to arise during the course. And this goes along with this idea of the crowdsourced rules. A lot of times people do crowdsourcing in advance. They say, I'm going to create this game, we're going to create this game, Twitter versus Zombies. Let's crowdsource the rules together. It's sort of an abstraction, and it doesn't necessarily always work as well as it could, so what we did is we decided to crowdsource the rules during the play of the game itself. So let's make these three very simple rules, bite, dodge, and swipe, and then let's crowdsource the more sort of elaborate interpretations of those rules and sort of additional rules during the game itself, which has turned out to be a great amount of fun. We get all these suggestions about rules, and then we kind of determine which ones to implement and how to implement them within the framework that's there. So I think that this is sort of important in the classroom too, not necessarily to determine your pedagogical strategies in advance for any given class, whether it's online or in an on-ground classroom, but to really allow some of those rules to emerge from within the class itself.
The third principle that we'd like to reflect on is self-legislation, which for both of us, is a pretty important pedagogical principle before the game. In our pedagogy for years, even before we began working together, we've always tried to work off of a student-centered model where we facilitated conversation, composition, whatever the activity of the class is, and then kind of step out of the way and allow students to kind of determine, in many ways, their own, really their own actions. And this can be as simple as in a composition class where instead of telling students this is the topic of the paper I want you to write, instead leaving that open, giving them some parameters about what a good topic might be or how a good topic might be constructed, and then allowing them to build that. So that self-legislation was an important part of the game. We did not want to be the police of this game. And very early on we decided, at first we were going to kind of just watch the game, and then we decided that we actually wanted to play. So the fact that we were able to step in and play the game as participants and kind of answer questions that might come up about the rules was interesting and helpful. The most important kind of person who rose to the top of these kinds of conversations that we have to mention is a colleague of ours in Florida, Lonnie Wilson, who was kind of instrumental in building the idea of a zombie MOOC that he and Jesse are going to run in the spring. And in his playing of the game and in his work with us in administering some of the rule changes, Lonnie became kind of like the godfather of the game as it was being played. He was, especially for the first half of the game, he was on the computer way more than we thought was humanly possible and answering questions, but really from kind of a player perspective and not as kind of an adjudicant. It was really interesting to watch students players of the game legislate the game. And maybe the most interesting moment that we'll end up maybe coming back to later was where a current student of mine who was playing the game, slipped up, got bitten, had been a human for most of the game. And because of some really kind of bizarre circumstances about how that had happened in the game, we said, we don't think that you need to turn. So we had this kind of back and forth conversation for about 5 minutes, and she decided, no, this is about digital literacy, and I put this hashtag into the tweet wrong, and that was why I should be turned. And so she made like a 2-minute movie and uploaded it to the game to explain why she decided the mistake that she had made, and why she decided that now, very reluctantly, she was going to have to turn to his arm.
Because no one caught her slip up. And so we told her, since no one caught, the game was not self-legislated. And in this case, you are the self who needs to legislate. So if you decide that you want to turn into a zombie, you can, but you can also just decide that it's like in chess. If you make one mistake and then you're 3 moves into the game, you don't say, I'm going to dash all the last 3 moves because we made a mistake 3 moves ago. There's a way in which you have to just keep rolling with the game when those mistakes are made, but she felt like it was her ethical responsibilities, her sort of ethical duty. She's like, I put in a broken link into my tweet, and it needed to be a good link in order for me to save herself. And so the video she made is absolutely amazing. She's got this, I'm locked in a library, the zombies have snuck into my library, they've bitten me, and I'm slowly turning. I've got my favorite books here on the, it's a really wonderful video.
Yeah, we really thought while we were watching it yesterday that she was going to start crying. It was such an intense, impassioned kind of plea. This is my student Becca Hogue.
And ironically, she was bitten by my student in Portland. So his student in Atlanta was bitten. The one who snuck into the library and got her was my student in Portland.
Moving on past legislation, we want to talk about engagement. And Twitter is just an excellent kind of model for or a perfect framework, I think, for how to engage students in a digital sense. Because Twitter, like many other digital tools, offers lots of potential channels for communication. So you've got the ability to communicate with a large group using a hashtag. You've got the ability to send messages to people directly. You've even got the direct message kind of like, super back channel where participants can communicate in a place where nobody else can see, which was one thing that we found really interesting. We kept wondering if humans in the game were communicating through direct messages because they were just ghosts by the end. They weren't around at all. And that kind of engagement was really exciting for us to see. We always in our classes want to build kind of pedagogical dynamics such that students start talking to each other, such that things that might happen on a discussion board inside of an LMS or even in a face-to-face discussion becomes not just this hierarchical, vertical conversation between the student and the teacher, the question and the answer, but that instead things become more horizontal. Students respond to the questions of their peers. They bring expertise to the table that they've accumulated, and that was allowing that kind of engagement was important in the game.
And it's one of the big critiques of MOOCs right now, that they essentially don't scale because collaboration supposedly doesn't scale. And when you've got 100,000 people registered for a course, the idea is, or the critique is, that all you can do at that point is become content delivery. But if you think about collaboration and communication as this kind of nodal network, which is something that the connectivist MOOCs in Canada have really pushed, and the sort of people at the forefront of that movement have talked extensively about this idea that if you rely on these nodal networks that the internet creates on its own, one person that interacts with 15 other people on Twitter, one person writes a blog post, 50 people read it, 3 of those people write a blog post, 50 more people read those blog posts. You can create this essentially very large nodal network of collaboration and communication. I think during the game we lost our ability to archive the tweets for this game because there was something at 1500, the Twitter API doesn't play really nice with you anymore, and a lot of the analysis tools don't work. So, and I think we've hit something like 5,000 or 6,000 tweets. It was up to 1,500 to 2,000 a day during the game.
The reflection component, which we started sifting in after gameplay began, we didn't really want people realizing as they began the game that they were going to be asked to write or to analyze the gameplay. We wanted them to just play. But the reflection became part of the gameplay because as we opened up a rule halfway through the game where zombies could earn extra bytes and humans could build safe zones by writing blog reflections. And as those blog reflections started to pile up, it was clear, and we had some debate about this, the only way that we referred to these in the rules were that the blog post had to be, we just used the word substantive. And we knew that people were gonna, we were worried that people were immediately going to start saying, what is a substantive blog post? How many paragraphs is it? How many words is a substantive blog post? We didn't get that question once. We didn't see one blog post that we felt like was non-substantive, which we kind of expected, because if somebody, were trying to compose one of those things in 5 minutes, which we were worried they were going to try and do, then it might get thin. But we found all of the work that players contributed was reflective, and especially in the document that we may be showing off closer to the end, the one thing that we asked them to do today was go on and fill out a survey that we put in a Google Doc. And at this point, this survey is up to, I don't know, maybe 2,500 or 3,000 words, where players are going in and annotating questions and talking back and forth to each other about their answers.
3,600 words. We just released this morning, an hour or two before we came here, and it's up to 3,600 words of crowdsourced reflections.
And one interesting thing I'll say that has to do with reflection and engagement, one of our friends and colleagues that we taught with at Georgia Tech, Andy Famiglietti, made a reference in his reflection on the game that it was interesting that because Twitter kind of focuses the activity around nodes and kind of like central connection points, so you have somebody that several people know, and when that person talks, they kind of activate the whole network a little bit. That those people were the first to go down in the game. They were the first people to get bitten by zombies, and so the algebra of the game kind of removed from the human population the ability to communicate more easily. Like humans had to seek each other out. And that was interesting because the zombie communication network was way more robust. And as those kind of like major actors on Twitter got turned, the human conversation went very quiet.
So I think that the key thing that I learned from these various different experiences, whether it's MOOC, whether it's even the journal that we run, because there was a way in which we had a vision for what we wanted it to be when we started the journal, Hybrid Pedagogy, but we couldn't really, what we realized very quickly is we couldn't know what we wanted it to be until we saw what the community needed it to be. And the same thing with MOOC. We create this course, and you can't necessarily determine in advance what you want people to learn from the course, because you want them to be actively engaging with the material in such a way that it surprises even you who designed it. And I think that that's true of almost any game that we play, that there's a way in which what becomes interesting is the way that people experiment with the rules, the way that they break the rules, the way that they might use a tool for something it wasn't intended for. And those, to me, those sort of emergent possibilities are the things that I'm most interested in. Those to me are the moments of real learning, the moments when people find sort of ways to use the rules towards their own advantage and sort of invent their own outcomes. So our last item here is just don't wield outcomes like a weapon. You don't need to, going guns blazing into a course with all of your outcomes sort of all determined in advance can often restrict the learning that happens within the course, because then every activity you create, everything that happens in the class, you're constantly looking, or the game for that matter, you're constantly looking for ways that it can get them towards the outcome. But build a structure in which learning can happen and then allow it to emerge. So in a sense, allow different kinds of learning to happen from different people and in different ways in a given class. Embrace chaos and play, revel in the tangents and the moments where the unexpected can happen. So some of the things that the people playing Twitter versus Zombies learned. We just created a bit of a list here, but I think we could go on and riff off of this list. The simple things. And we sort of knew they'd learn how to do this if they hadn't used Twitter. And I was really struck by how many people that hadn't really used Twitter at all became Twitter junkies over the weekend. It's amazing to see his student, for example, I think tweeted more times in this weekend than she had tweeted with her account at all previous. And she now is affectionately called the Zombie Queen. Tweet with a hashtag, insert a link into a tweet, build Twitter lists, follow people on Twitter, and then we advance that to having them upload media, link to blog posts, watch people's feeds. The zombies at one point were watching people's feeds to see when they would show up on Twitter so that they could bite them. So they would, because we had a rule that you couldn't bite someone who hadn't tweeted in the last 5 minutes. So people would sit there and stalk humans' Twitter feeds. The zombies became so powerful because they were using these kind of skills and just stalking people's Twitter feeds. Using Twitter as a collaboration tool, the way that they were kind of swarming, the kind of swarm mentality that they created. I mean, what it is you can imagine, well, they're just swarming around humans, you know, it's a game, but there's a way in which that's what networking is also. When Adeline tries to get people to come to this event, there's a way in which that's also a kind of swarm, a sort of viral swarming around the link to this event. They were obviously direct messaging, kind of behind the scenes, and then we had them do it using Storify. We introduced a rule called Antidote and one called Zombie Peace. The zombies decided that they wanted to harbor a peace treaty, and
Only some of them.
so we had two factions. We had the faction, actually some of the zombies developed a zombie constitution. I mean, and all of these things were emergent. We didn't ask for a zombie constitution, but the zombies who were really like, this needs to be a world of zombies, wrote a zombie constitution, and it's something like a 2,000-word document. Meanwhile, his Twitter handle is CogDog Alan Levine, who's a really cool guy doing some connectivist MOOC work attached to DS-106, which is a digital storytelling class. He wrote the original Zombies for Peace treaty document, and then we decided just emergently, well, let's just throw that into the rules. You can use hashtag zombie peace, but in order to sign the treaty, you have to create a storify of your experience within the game. So then we had all these people signing the zombie peace. I actually signed it in the wee hours of the night last night. I signed the zombie peace treaty and made a storify. He did not sign. So we were on opposite factions. They wrote to save their life. The idea with the safe zone rule was that it only made them safe for 1 hour, and they had to write a blog post, a substantive blog post. And so we had people at various different stages of the game writing a blog post once an hour to keep using this safe zone. And so, I mean, they were literally writing to save their life, probably producing more words than they produced in the last few months.
Yeah, to add to that, I'll say that one of our players, Anna Smith, who's a teacher in New York, who's just gone through this kind of actual apocalyptic moment in New York City, having gone through the hurricane, wrote a blog post yesterday to make a safe zone for herself, where she kind of compared what being in New York for the last week is like, reflecting that or contrasting that with Twitter versus zombies, and how one apocalypse and the other were completely different experiences.
And then they also negotiated this whole piece that for the last 24 hours, essentially this peace treaty and the Constitution have been like at the center of the game, people negotiating, rewriting the Constitution, trying to push people towards zombie peace. And since the game just ended 30 minutes ago, we don't really know how the game ended. And I think, don't wield outcomes like a weapon. In a way, it doesn't matter how the game ended. The game sort of was in the moment. And then lastly, they reflected on their learning about a tool, Twitter, both from within the tool and outside it. But I think it moves well beyond that it isn't just, it's about experience and communication and collaboration, that they also reflected on how we make stuff happen in the digital world.
So we talked a little bit longer than we intended when we put our notes together, but in most of the projects that we do on hybrid pedagogy, we kind of get really invested in building something, and then right as that thing is ending, we have some question that we feel like is going to fuel the next piece of writing or research that we want to do. And one thing that's come up kind of on the periphery of all of this weekend is this idea of rigor. Rigor, a word that we talk about a lot in educational communities, and that sometimes seems like a very traditional kind of gatekeeping word. And so our next kind of project coming out of Twitter versus Zombies is going to be to really apply the idea that in a networked or a digital media sense or a 21st century learning sense, that rigor really can have another iteration. That there's a traditional kind of scholarly rigor that might say that the kind of activity that happens in a MOOC or in any kind of digital collaborative environment is just less rigorous, less attention focused, more frenetic and less scholarly. And we're really interested in kind of leaning on that concept a whole bunch and seeing if we can kind of define a second kind of application of academic rigor to the work that we've been doing for the last 7 or 8 months.
So we've got a lot of questions on the table for us all to just hopefully have an open discussion for the rest of the time that we have here. Games, play, chaos, emergent learning, MOOCs, And then this question that we're leaving you with was sort of what is intellectual rigor and how can we reimagine intellectual rigor in relationship to all these other things that we've thrown out there.
So I have a few questions from the Twitterverse, if you'd like to take them first, as you were speaking. Jay did ask, what if some students, I don't know what her real name is yet. Sorry, Jay. That's okay.
But shouldn't you ask it in person?
Oh, you,
yeah,
Jay.
Here,
Yes,
yeah.
Jay. Hi, Jay. Okay, so you can ask that question.
So this comes up a lot whenever I'm discussing anything that has to do with digital and the digital as a space that allows for these type of collaborations to exist, especially when they start getting really big. What happens to the voices that are usually on the margins of these spaces? I think you posted something about the racial aspect of zombies, and my question is, so I'm really interested in the racial history of zombies and how that gets erased. And I feel like this is something that erased it again. So if I start playing and I start talking about that, does that make me a bad player? And what are the ways to allow those voices to exist within the game and not feel like I'm somehow ruining the game? Especially if it's self-police.
Interestingly, that actually became, that question came up within the game itself. And I think it's definitely worth talking about and worth thinking about what happened in this game and sort of who lived inside of the game. Pete and I were just talking as we came that there's a way in which the humans versus zombies game, the campus game, skews much more male, whereas we've noticed that Twitter versus zombies has actually skewed more female. I mean, we don't have any statistics on that, but just anecdotally, it appears to have skewed much more female, which is kind of cool to notice. But then also, I think that the issue of race is worth talking about as well as thinking about the issues of class and issues of availability of technology, because even if anyone can use technological tools at the library, you sort of needed to live with a really, really honking computer in order to, master Twitter versus zombies, I think.
Another thing that I thought about while you were asking that question is that I've heard this question a good bit, and I think that it also has another end of it. We talk about the kinds of students who are maybe silenced by digital environments or something. It's also true in the classroom that the digital environment sometimes opens a voice for students who don't normally vocally participate. So before I start doing a lot of this kind of like perforated class activity, and I just started working with like a discussion board or discussion forum in classes, I found that there were students who traditionally I might have thought just weren't participating, weren't engaging with the material, but when they had a place to write where they didn't have to interrupt other people or they didn't have to talk over other people, they participated more. So I think that there's two sides to that question. And sometimes opening up that channel encourages people to participate that weren't participating before. But we did get at least one person on Twitter calling our attention to a discussion of race and zombies while the game was going on. She just popped in, she wasn't playing, she just popped in and said, have we talked about this, or is this something that you've considered? So those are all questions that I think are worth spending more time thinking about it after it's finished.
Would you say this kind of thing more teaches, I'm trying to think about how to put it, but methods rather than specific content, and how do you think about those two things in relation to each other? Because in some ways, yeah, obviously people are learning how to use Twitter, and that's great. It's an exercise to help people learn to use Twitter, but can you say more about what else you feel like people are?
Yeah, there's a way in which maybe the zombies part could be arbitrary, that you could almost replace it with anything. But I don't know, I think that there's a way in which we also pushed on the sort of narrative, the zombie narrative as well during the game. There was definitely people concocting stories, and there was a really nice thing that would happen when we released a new rule, that people would be talking about how that rule did or did not fit into the sort of ethos of the zombie narrative. And so there's a way in which we did have a content, the zombies became a content area that was explored. It became explored in people's blog posts and whatnot. But I think it probably is more methodological.
Well, I was just thinking about that collaborative document you flashed up briefly and the reflective aspect in general, and that I suppose what you could be doing is doing a whole bunch of experiments to see how people behave in social media and then abstracting out general principles so that you can then do subsequent study. And then in a way that's what you're ultimately doing. You know, I don't mean this in a bad way, but you're turning people into guinea pigs so that you can figure out how this medium works and how people develop, like you said, emergent behavior within that context. Does that feel like kind of what you're doing?
Yeah, I would say that, I mean, we've had a lot of conversations since we started the journal about how new media really proposes a new kind of epistemology. And I think that part of that kind of epistemological shift is one where that we approach information more methodologically and less from the position of content and vertical canons and all of that stuff. So, so yeah, I think that that's an important component. This comment keeps coming up in my head the last 2 or 3 weeks as we've been presenting, but Clay Shirky says that we used to talk about information overload, but really we need to start thinking about filter failure. And if that's the case, then it's less about all the things that we can, all the pieces of data that we can collect, but building a filter that allows us to continue to collect or thresh information kind of more critically.
I think almost any course that I teach, and this ends up being true of my online courses, my on-ground courses, MOOC, Twitter versus Zombies, Digital Writing Month, the subject is learning. So one of the subjects that the students and me are exploring throughout the entire thing is just the subject of our own learning and how our own learning happens, and constantly thinking about, okay, I did this activity, what am I learning from it? So constantly having that reflective moment where I think about how is my own learning happen. So that's what I want my students to be. I want them to be experts in their own learning by the end of the class. And they're much more poised to be experts in their own learning than I am poised to be experts in their learning.
That makes me think about, remember when you were talking about how they didn't question what substantive connoted for their blog posts? It just goes back to the whole intuitive nature of play to me, that they were just intuiting that for themselves through that process.
Yeah. If you tell someone that 500 words is substantive, they might give you 500 words. If you tell them substantive, they could give you 10,000 words.
What does it mean to you?
Yeah.
And how do you construct your ideas about?
And it was interesting how again, like, method became more important than content. So at one point, we instituted a rule where a human could use a weapon to neutralize a zombie, and they had to just take a picture of something found in their house that they would use as a weapon. So at one point, one of our friends in this great ed tech writer, Audrey Waters, Jessie bit her, and she responded with a weapon tag with a picture of a cup of coffee, and said in the body of her tweet that she was using a cup of coffee to stun the zombie. Immediately, nobody had any issue with coffee being a weapon. The issue was that the tweet was not formatted the right way, and that it showed up 1 minute after her 5-minute bite clock had elapsed. And so, we jumped on, and at least one other person jumped on and said, an invalid weapon, not because, nobody said because it's coffee, but because these
the hashtag wasn't
yeah,
right.
these rules that are these really simple rules about how the hashtags are, or how the tweets are built to function in the game, that did not work. So the action did not work. There were lots of bizarre weapons.
A couch. Someone dropped a couch out
cat.
of the window. A cat. Someone threw a cat at someone. So I'm curious, if people want to get to this idea of rigor, does anybody want to press on that a little bit and say, just suggest to us, I'm totally fine if someone says, no, this doesn't seem rigorous. Like Twitter versus Zombies. We didn't roll this out in a 4-credit class. We rolled it out on the web. And it could have just been a fun thing that we did on the weekend, but already we're starting to think about how we might use something like this in a class, in a 4-credit class at a accredited institution. So I'm curious what people think about this question of rigor. Is what we're describing here rigorous? Are these sort of experiments we do on the web fit into what your idea of intellectual rigor is?
It's a pretty vast question, but I think you've talked a little bit about sampling, which is something that people in psychology do through Amazon, on a regular basis, right? So certainly the kind of activity where you sample on a large public like this within a framework is pretty rigorous activity in a lot of ways. I would also say that the self-reflexive nature of the activity is really part of what I would define as part of the traditional definition of rigor. I mean, rigor doesn't mean citing sources and doing an articulated textual argument. It means understanding what your framework is. And there are some traditional psychological experimental stuff that's in this kind of activity, sampling that you're doing. So, I have no trouble with the term rigor at all.
Do you think that, do you is it convincing, this idea that rigor changes? That what was rigorous before this moment that we're kind of loosely defining becomes, that the rigor now is different from rigor before?
Yes and no. I mean, there is change in the sense that you do have access to large crowdsourcing types of activities that can actually produce results there. I mean, it's pretty striking when Sebastian Thrun says that, in Udacity, if you tweak the presentation of a course within 48 hours, you have 10,000 hits you can work with to find out what the results of that tweak were. And that's something that I don't think has been available in pedagogical context before. So that's an enormous difference, I think, historically.
I think there's a new source of rigor in the extent to which collaboration is necessary, where instead of just suggested. And that seems like a new source of rigor.
I was having a discussion with someone, I think at lunch yesterday, with a few people who are in this room, and sort of arguing that the idea of, in the academy, we hold on to this idea of the scholarly monograph, the idea of the monograph, that it's written by one person, and that somehow is the highest form of academic work. And I've actually found that these collaborations that I've started to do feel so much more rigorous than that singularly authored work that I did before, where I've basically kind of rejected the idea that it's important for me to do singular work, because the collaborative work I do feels like I get so much out of it, and it feels so rich, and it feels so difficult and hard, that I actually think there's a way in which collaborative work becomes the highest standard of rigor, as opposed to singular authored academic monographs.
I fundamentally agree with that. I mean, I think that one of the things that's clear is that the questions that interest this generation of new scholars aren't too hard for one person. I mean, you need to crowdsource somehow. You need to have some kind of collaborative framework, because if you just look at the post-colonial, for example, it's something that spans the gamut of the literary to the psychological, to the sociological, to the philosophical. And the notion that one person can master that kind of large question, for me, is one of the reasons why we're going toward collaborative work. I mean, the questions are broader. I mean, it's just these aren't. You can do a specialist question if you want, but I mean, the kind of broad problems that interest people seem to be those they need help on.
Well, this reminds me of something I keep on thinking about, which is the difference between crowdsourcing and group sourcing. Because I kind of get annoyed by projects that say, and release it to the crowd, and magically, wisdom will emerge. But this is really more of a group sourcing, because it's some self-selecting group of people who are consciously agreeing to abide by some set of rules to produce a greater good, one might argue. And I think a lot of
Saving the world.
effect, how about that? But I do think that we start to get into these kind of nuanced discussions of what is a useful collaboration versus what is just sort of throwing things together. And sometimes, as you say, there are emergent moments. So you don't want to close out those possibilities by over curating. So that's one of the things I think is most interesting about this kind of project is how do you decide what the rules and bounds are and where the openness is, but then also who the participants are and how they self-select as people who should be participating.
Yeah. I think when you create any sort of, whether it's a massive experiment like this or a MOOC, it has to be really scalable because you don't necessarily know how many people are going to show up. We had to create this event so that 15 people could play, or that 10,000 could play, because we had no idea what would happen. We only started promoting it, I think, 36 hours before the game began, so we probably weren't going to get 5,000 people. But I like what you say about self-selecting, because this is the registration form. Really simple, but there's a self-selection here. It says I have to check a box and hit submit, just that simple act of typing in your Twitter handle, clicking I am a human, and hitting submit, and then that automatically populates them on the spreadsheet so that they can then play the game. That one little act is almost enough of a self-selecting to say I am now part of this community.
Well, and then there's a whole apparatus behind it too, of people who would think that this was something to do, or like, I knew I had a lot of deadlines today, so I couldn't do it. I just didn't have time, so I didn't want to commit and then not be able to follow through. So there's all kinds of other dramas that are going on behind the scenes that get you to that narrow little group of people who actually do participate, and that's as interesting as as the individual moment of I'm a human or something like that.
Yeah, we found that was true with MOOC too. That there were some people said when we were building, when we announced when we were going to do MOOC, and for a lot of people it was a week before school began for the fall semester. They said, "Oh my gosh, it's a horrible time. Everybody's building their SOBI, and that's a bad time." We thought, what is the good time?
No, there's never a good time. It's just
and so there were people who, just from the beginning said, I'm really interested in this project, I'm going to follow it, I'm curious, but I can't participate. And just even as simple as like making a conversation like this available to people who are teaching right now or in class right now, is the thing that permits engagement even beyond the event itself, which is useful, I think.
I think that the thing that maybe this is a sort of way to push the conversation, the thing that we're trying to do, we've talked a lot about, sort of arose during MOOC, the idea of MOOCification, that it doesn't necessarily have to be about let's make this plethora of MOOCs, but can we MOOCify courses that we're already teaching? Can we just bring in some of the pedagogical elements of a MOOC, some of the positive pedagogical elements of a MOOC into our, the courses that we're already running? And how can we do that? And so I think things like this are really our testing ground for how we can make that happen. Could we do something like this in a class? And we've already started to talk about doing a zombie MOOC that would be a class. It would be sort of connected to one of his classes in Atlanta, one of my classes in Portland, and also Lonnie Wilson in Florida would also be involved in it. So we would both have it connected to actual classes that are going on, but then also have it open to the community and doing things like playing these kind of games to make bridges across classes. Because I think the thing that a MOOC does for me is that you don't have to have a class at an institution with a closed wall around it and a door that shuts anymore. You can essentially have my students interacting with his students. My student did, bite his student and is responsible for the, her fall from grace. And I think that that's a really wonderful thing, to bust the walls of the class down so that we don't try and take learning and fit it inside of what I see as kind of an arbitrary box. So I'm curious, my question for all of you is how you see, and I think she has questions from the Twitterverse.
Well, I actually have a question from me.
Oh, okay. Awesome.
Sometimes she looks up.
Occasionally. Going back to your question about collaboration and rigor, so I think one of the things that's making it difficult to document collaborative work as rigorous is that we need to justify to search committees and promotion and tenure committees what you actually did, especially in the humanities. So, with projects like yours, which are so free-flowing and emergent, how would you make the case? Do you have any models to make this case for people who want to hear about, what was somebody's original contribution?
I think that's an important thing for us to talk about. I'm curious to hear what everybody else here thinks about that.
Yeah, like how would we put this on our CV, for example?
Well, it's absolutely fascinating. If you're talking about any of the bench sciences and any of the quantitative social sciences, you know, collaborative articles are the
Right.
money of the realm. I mean,
Right.
you know, and it's absolutely amazing when you sit in a tenure committee and you hear the two different discourses side by side. I think we're in a pretty transitional moment, and I think that there is an opening toward the notion that in humanities and interpretive social sciences that collaborative projects are more and more coming to tenure committees. I wouldn't say it's easy. I wouldn't say that it's going to happen overnight. And I have heard the question more than once. You know, what did this person really contribute to this? You know, which I think is absolutely amazing because you know, if you're in econ and you know there's a certain math problem you need solved to actually make an argument, you just go to somebody else and he or she co-authors. You know, because the person has a solution to bring to the. So I mean, I find it absolutely astounding that people are stuck, but I admit that they are. But I would say that, you know, in discussions that I've heard, you know, the door is slowly cracking. I think if you do a collaborative project, you have to explain what the value added was to actually do a collaborative project. It's really crucial. If you can't do that, then people are just going to ask the simple question. But,
And in some ways, the monograph actually obscures the level of collaboration that actually
Absolutely.
goes on in single author projects.
Absolutely.
Like how much the other people read your work and provide developmental editing for you, and they're just in the footnote or in the
Right.
preface.
Right.
But they actually really shape the work of your peer reviewers as well. And so collaborative projects make that more explicit.
Yeah, so from my perspective as somebody who's teaching under just a teaching, I mean, I only have a teaching position right now, so in one sense that's freeing because I can do all of this work and not worry about whether it's going to be counted toward tenure promotion for me. In another sense, I have to do two people's work, and I'm constantly doing it. I mean, one because I'm very interested and passionate about it, but two because I'm thinking about how all of that's going to translate somewhere else later. If I were having to do this and worry the whole time about whether somebody was going to think it was valid scholarship, I don't know.
you know, corresponds to the spectrum of the definition of what original contribution to the field is. I mean, you know, if you're in bench science and you have a large number of grants and you have a certain number of citations, that's your original contribution to the field.
Right.
So there, you know, those are easy measuring terms that you can use in certain disciplines. The problem is in humanities, interpretive social sciences, citational stuff doesn't work very well. You know, and you don't have grants, so how do you define an original contribution to the field? Well, you know, you sign your name to it. I mean, that just boils down to that,
Right.
basically.
Exactly. And also sometimes you wonder if this work that we're looking at when we look at Twitter versus zombies, is this the scholarship, or do we have to now go and write an article about Twitter versus zombies in order for that to be the scholarship? Which is the scholarship?
Yeah, yeah.
Because and
probably,
see,
yeah.
what was that? Go ahead.
I think the latter is true. If you wanted to count in a university environment, you probably got to write up the analysis of people actually get.
I wanted to respond to that point and also bringing somebody else on the Twitterverse. I think that maybe the shift for you would be, I mean, a lot of digital projects are the same way, right? So they simply exist as a project with no interpretive layer. And what you would be doing if you actually wrote a peer-reviewed article on Twitter versus zombies is adding that kind of interpretive layer. But I think that probably is an option for you to try to find a way to include an interpretive layer digitally. And then you can make the argument that this is a scholarly project, because that's what we all want. We all want a theory of interpretation in your work. And second thing is, Carrie Padilla asked this really great question. Doesn't the CV question have the same answer as the question of outcomes for students learning?
Yeah, I sort of think so. I think that Carrie Padian is my student, and she's absolutely amazing. That's a little plug for her. She's making a really great point, which is that we as scholars and as teachers, we so often do things because they will fit in a line on our CV. It's not always the best thing for us to be doing for our own learning and our own advancement. For example, is it a better use of my time to experiment and do another game that continues to evolve this? Might that be a better use of my own time than writing the article that then would allow me to have the line on my CV. So it's this idea of don't wield outcomes like a weapon, don't do things just to get a line on your CV. At the end of the day, we need to be doing things that evolve us as thinkers and evolve us as sort of collaborators and community members. And it might be that I have a really good relationship with someone. I know that this is true of a lot of digital humanities scholars, where they have a really good relationship with someone where there's a way in which one person might do the technical work and then the other person writes up the analysis, and both are equal contributors and sort of doing equal scholarly work. So I think we have to kind of push on that idea that we have to write it up in order for it to count. Because I think that the collaboration issue can help address that. Although it sort of does need to get written up, otherwise it kind of disappears.
Right.
And that's
the comment I wanted to make. I mean, this is was a great experiment, but it's going to disappear, and what it really means is going to disappear. I mean, you'll enrich it with the next iteration of whatever it is, but at some point the iterations have to stop for a moment and reflect on
Right, which is in some way why we feel like MOOC is still not over for us, because
Right.
MOOC had over 600 people participating in it for 6 days, and the amount of documents that were generated, we could almost keep up with what was generated in Twitter versus Zombies. MOOC was off the chain. So until we write that article, which we keep talking about, until we write that MOOC article that kind of collects all of that knowledge, then yeah, you're right.
That's the dilemma. I mean, I totally take your point that in fact it's more useful pedagogically for you to take things in the classroom that come out of experiments like that. But it is a scholarly community in some ways, and so you have to let other people know.
Right.
How are you assessing outcomes? What kind of metrics? This project actually has some pretty clear, measurable outcomes of students learning, of using different levels of Twitter or Storyfy in their writing. So you could chart that out. You might have to. I think there's some greater overarching education that has to happen, maybe to convince leadership that Twitter's not like some time-wasting game. It's a legitimate networking device, and so maybe that's part of the ongoing thing is not only how do we derive metrics and how do we assess outcomes from MOOCs, but when you're using the media that is not understood always by your deans or other people, that's another.
Yeah, this is why I feel like the classes that I'm teaching this semester in new media literacy, I feel like I keep returning to this idea. I've kind of got my students sometimes at this saturation point where I introduce one more tool and they're like, oh my gosh, I had to make a blog, and then I had to get on Twitter and all of these things. And so every once in a while we need to take these steps back and say, and even for this game, like this game is not even necessarily about Twitter. It's about the kind of behavior that Twitter enables. So that if Twitter turned around tomorrow and did something that made us all upset, which it completely could do, that we would be able, that it wouldn't be done. We wouldn't put it away and say, oh, well, Twitter's gone, so now that wasn't helpful, that wasn't learning. But the behaviors and the methods that happen on Twitter could be reproduced in other spheres. And I feel like I want to stress that all the time, because if we don't stress that, then we run the risk of communicating to our peers and to our students that, well, he's just somebody who teaches people how to use Twitter. And I don't want to do that. I don't want to do that. And in fact, I want to, we talk a lot about when I introduce the idea of Twitter literacy in class, I do have a population of students that say, oh, Twitter, like it's just people taking pictures of their breakfast. And so, we talk about how we're not just using Twitter, but we're using
Facebook.
Yeah, maybe or iPhones. So yeah, I think that kind of meta layer of like, why are we even talking about a tool is an important thing for us to engage into.
In defense of the traditional way of thinking, just to play devil's advocate for a minute. So I know probably a lot of people, I know one of my colleagues tweeted like, oh, now I see what this hashtag was all about this weekend, because he's actually following our conversation now. But imagine somebody coming in and hearing a little bit about this at the end, and maybe watching our video once this is over, and wondering, how can I find out what Twitter and Zombies actually went, what happened, and how, and you know, what was successful, what people learned, and everything. If you wrote a peer-reviewed article, that would help them to understand it, because you could give the history, the chronology, all those things. And so
Right.
in that sense, I mean, it is useful too.
For sure,
Yeah.
for sure, yeah.
Which is, maybe, you know, we could think about the project, the tool as one dimension,
Right.
WCV, and another, and
Right. Yeah, it's an experiment. You know,
Yeah.
like you think it from a scientific point of view, you would just look at it as an experiment.
And important to always reflect. I mean, that's the idea that there's constant reflection. Although this, I think, also creating events where reflection is built into the event itself, so that that reflection is being done not just by me having created the event, but also happening constantly within the event itself. I think that that's really the key, so that it isn't just me reflecting on the event, but it's also the community itself that's reflecting on the event. There's a way in which this is the potential peer-reviewed article that I've got on the screen, the crowdsourced
Exactly.
reflections. And then I might be involved in helping curate this and make it what it needs to be to go out there. But just when I look through this and just create it in a single day, and some of the thoughts that are in here are so good and so much better than anything I could have produced just by myself, that I think that that's really, really important.
I'm wondering what some of the people who haven't been talking are thinking about all of this.
I have a question. If you yourselves are still grounded in a physical institution, academy, and this is a new tool, is it merely an added layer to what is being done already, or do you, in your desire to break down walls, does it have a collateral impact to the classroom or learning environments? Would it fundamentally change that as two complementary or multiple complementary tools?
I think our sort of idea is that, and this is the thesis of hybrid pedagogy, is that all learning is necessarily hybrid. That essentially it is infiltrating everything that we do. The digital is infiltrating everything we do. If we think about how we shop now compared to how we shopped 10 years ago, and then compare that to how we shopped 20 years ago, it's fundamentally different. And I think the same thing is happening with education. And it's not something that I value it's not something I want to evaluate by saying it's good or bad. We just have to recognize that things are fundamentally changing. The digital is fundamentally changing how we learn, what we do in classrooms, and I think that what we do is we don't necessarily respond to it in a reactionary way, but we respond to it in a really thoughtful, critical way to say, this is what's happening. What can I make of that? Let's talk about what's happening. Let's engage our students in getting into a conversation about how what we're doing in the classroom is changing.
I would add to that I think that there is an aspect of it that just does fundamentally challenge certain institutional ideas and frameworks. And I think that everybody who does work like this, I'm not sure what like this exactly means, but who does kind of collaborative or new media inflected work, at some point, at some day, they have to like decide what that means for them, you know, and how much their participation in these kinds of activities or scholarship that's like this or whatever kind of is gonna hit a wall against which they'll stop or they'll push. So I think about that all the time, really, that fundamental change, and I think that it's inevitable.
People are talking about that a lot with MOOCs, that MOOCs are swooping in and changing the institute, you know, changing higher ed as we know it, and that they're gonna come and trample on everything that we so value. You know, I love books, and I love libraries, and I love classrooms. These are things I love. I don't want them completely trampled on. What do you guys all think? Is that something that you're afraid of? And does the sort of thing that we're talking about, does that feel like it could potentially trample on the things that you sort of love about higher ed?
Well, one thing, I guess working with some undergrads over the years, I've noticed, maybe not so much here, but like at my other school, there's this tendency for students to migrate towards like these games, to almost as if they see like it's, you know, it'll be an easy A, or, you know, it'll be kind of like an easier course to take. And so they take these courses to kind of get away from that traditional like classroom experience, you know, where there is traditional rigor, I guess. And so I guess I could see how maybe this leads to larger vacancies, I guess, in the classroom experience, maybe.
Vacancies like population vacancies
Yeah,
or like
like-
competency vacancies?
Like classroom vacancies, like more teachers want to avoid teaching those classes that none of their students will want to go to because they're all maybe involved in like these other kinds of ways of learning, which I think are incredibly valuable, but I can kind of see the logistics of enrollment, I guess, and how, people might be more, more interested in these kinds of things than other means of learning, I guess. I don't know what you think of that. And also I was thinking about how does evaluation come into play with this? Like how does a teacher really gauge the level of rigor in whatever form it is? Like how does a teacher kind of gauge that in this kind of situation?
Like how do you grade humans versus zombies? I mean,
Yeah.
Twitter versus zombies.
Yeah, or provide feedback if it is this kind of,
Just become a zombie.
Yeah.
Part of me, and maybe this is just sort of playing, maybe I don't actually believe this, but I'm gonna put it out there to see what you all think. And that is that if students are migrating towards a learning experience because it's very fruitful to them, then maybe whatever they're leaving needs to adapt so that they migrate, maybe that then is a good migration. It's a migration towards sort of the most profitable experience for them. And by profitable, I don't mean obviously money, although that might be involved at some point if you're talking about accreditation and degrees and whatnot. But I mean profitable in the sense of it is a more lively, excited, animated learning experience for them. And I want to create those.
Well, there's one thing you guys said a couple of times that reminded me of back in the day when I used to teach composition, freshman comp, when you talked about the volume of writing. Because the obvious critique is, well, just because they're writing a lot doesn't mean it's good. But on the other hand, I remember from teaching comp classes that simply writing in itself was kind of a good. And I wonder if things like simple volume or frequency or those types of metrics might actually feel like they're useful in this kind of context.
We were just talking about this morning, actually. We were applying this idea of rigor and the reflections that people were putting on the evaluation and saying, well, I mean, we love this, it's really interesting, but is it just word count, is that what we're going for? I don't think that is. And I think it comes down to the difference between what you're trying to do with a particular assignment and the idea of like low stakes and high stakes assignments. Making Twitter versus Zombies a high stakes assignment in and of itself would be disastrous, because if you're a human, you get an A, I guess, or if you tweet, 50,000 words, you get an A or something like that. That's never going to work. But the thing that Twitter versus Zombies, it's funny. I always think about grade. We're so attached to the idea of like assessment and specifically grading. Immediately, whenever I think about grading, I think about the other ways in which we're graded that are so much more interesting and that all of us are way more okay with. Like the way that a game grades us. The way that the street, when we're learning how to ride a bike, grades us, in two ways. And I think that coming out of a game like this, what I started thinking of last night is this Twitterland constitution started unraveling or started spooling out, is that you had at this point this seed of like this amazing ethical political science project where 5 or 6 people who were into this document had no idea 48 hours ago that they were interested in building this. And so the thing that they then go and build afterwards becomes the thing that's a high stakes grade. But how much better is that thing going to be? Because they landed on something that, that just kind of improvisationally, they just, they self-selected. So I think, for me, the answer is a lot of low stakes interactions and a few high stakes ones.
one of my colleagues from Stockton College, Laura Zucconi, she's designing a game, role-playing game on teaching disease in history classes right now. And she asked, what does your experiment, how does it mirror what was going on in the Open University experiment of the 80s, where they ran distance classes through the BBC with up to 10,000 students in one biology class and standardized testing.
You know about this?
I don't really know too much
I
about
don't
it.
know about it.
I don't know much about it either.
I'm a little concerned about the idea that I'm concerned with the model where we have MOOCs or we have online experiences like this and then we accredit through standardized tests. That just causes me some grief and some internal trepidation. The idea that, because then what it is to me it's like you're evaluating the wrong thing. You're evaluating it's evaluating the product, not the process. The process is what we need to find ways to evaluate, and I think we just have to reinvent our notions of what assessment are. Same way we have to refashion tenure and promotion. If collaboration is going to be key to the work that we do, we have to rethink the way that we do tenure and promotion in order to change our system of evaluation. I've taught a class where I had 25 students making a single film. They all worked together collaboratively to make a single film. Very, very hard to evaluate that using any traditional mode of evaluation. Essentially, you have to throw everything out and start from scratch and say, this is what I want the students to do. I'm not going to determine my assessment practices in advance. I'm going to say, this is what I want them to achieve, this is what I want them to do, and then you have to figure out new modes of assessment in order to work through those kinds of...
Yeah, but I think it gets even more radical than that, because if you actually do assessment right, what you're doing is giving feedback in real time, as close to real time as you can. And in a self-paced online learning environment, if somebody has a chance to redo the stuff and to rework it and to come back with a new kind of state of learning of what the person's got, grades just are basically filters. I mean, you deliver content and then you decide who got it best and who didn't. It's not really assessment in the sense of real-time feedback. And once you start actually giving people a chance to master the material, well, all the grades actually, end up around A, right? Okay. So, I mean, to some extent, grades and assessment don't really go together. I mean, if you're actually doing the right kind of assessment, if you're putting on the table what you want people to get out of the experience, and you're giving them a self-paced chance to actually go back and pick it up and and get it right, everybody should cluster around A, right?
Right. That's where you want everyone. You want everyone arriving at mastery.
Exactly.
So why would you?
Right.
Yeah. Why would you look at these metrics where they say you should have this many C's and this
Right.
many B's?
Right. So I mean, if you really do assessment right, it seems to me you're enriching the pedagogical experience to such an extent that someone actually has a chance to master the material. And the material's mastered, well, everybody clusters around an A. So that's one thing. I mean, I think that we're in a pretty chaotic transition period. The university hasn't changed very much for 200 years. And I think you're absolutely right in pointing out the fact that the digital environment gives a whole new dimension of what's possible to do. And it's pretty unpredictable. And I think people get lost in the MOOC discussion too fast, because there are going to be some pioneers who are going to really, jump at this opportunity and really, get into it. Many of those MOOCs, some of those MOOCs will be pretty traditional because it will be a talking head. And, they won't be really leveraging the tools that are available. So what's going to happen is the tools are going to be used, assessed, and worked on, and then those that are really good are going to come back into other environments and be used. I mean, it's not that everybody's going to jump in and create online courses, but the people who do are going to experiment with it, and things are going to come out of that experience that will be shareable in modules, in approaches, in other kinds of learning environments. So
This is why we like to talk about MOOCs not as a thing, but as a strategy.
I mean, hybrid is the term I really like, and I really think you chose it wisely. I think that there's going to be an impact on all sorts of other kinds of learning environments, because people are going to learn how to leverage these tools and use them well. And boy, when that happens, boy, I'm going to pick up anything I can.
I think what's sort of happening is that there's all this sort of terror, this kind of abject fear about what the MOOCs can do. And the response that saddens me is the response where people say, well, let's make it really traditional and rigorous then, so that then they can say, oh, I see, that looks like something I recognize. Rather than doing what I think is the best possible thing to do, which is take this movement and say, what are the liberatory potentials of this movement and these technologies, and how can we take this and kind of completely reimagine? And I think that that's the more powerful thing to do.
And on the other side of that hinge, to talk to, because there's another whole university component that is excited about MOOCs or the potential that MOOCs deliver because they lower seat time and because they open up, like they allow you to have hybrid classrooms, and so they want to pour all this attention on it that way. And I think that we, at least the way that we've imagined our project on hybrid pedagogy the whole time, is to say, just digitizing something or PDFing all of the things that you usually used in a online or a face-to-face class is not that you lose all of the potential. And so we want to be able to kind of speak for a critical pedagogical perspective, to both sides, because to say, no to digital environments, or to say 100%, just make everything digital, neither of those positions represents pedagogical rigor. So I think that's where we always find the center of all the work that we're doing, is sitting in that place.
And I think one thing I'm really excited about is just that all of these rapid changes that are happening right now are bringing pedagogy, the discussion of pedagogy, to the forefront in a way that I haven't seen it. I actually felt like, because my primary research has always been pedagogy. I've always had a period and I've always had various topical interests, but from the beginning of my career, pedagogy has always been my first love. And there was a way in which for many, many years I felt like I almost had to keep that secret. And I was told that you shouldn't put that on top, because you're supposed to be a researcher in a field first and then a pedagogue second. And I'm really excited that it feels like there's an opening where we can bring pedagogy to the forefront and have it pedagogy within the humanities. So I'm still a humanist. Sort of pedagogy within the humanities becomes a field in its own right, which I think is really important.
You're absolutely right. There are many discussions that are being brought forth. You're absolutely right. Absolutely.
So I think we have time for one more question or comment. 2 minutes left.
Well, so the thing I always say about the split is that I think that new forms of knowledge production breaks down the distinction between research and pedagogy, and that this is the situation where you can't clearly define where one begins and the other ends. We're talking constantly in our lab universe about how do we create projects that people can be vertically integrated in, and that the lowliest of freshmen can participate meaningfully in, and yet postdocs and senior faculty and everybody will also be enriched by it. But in some ways, thinking about how the same ideas get filtered into different contexts and get enriched by different contexts without strictly being on one side or the other is the most interesting to me. So I'm always resistant to pure pedagogy conversations, maybe because I spent so many years working in academic technology where I felt like you, that it was in a sort of bastard child kind of situation. So I like the idea that we're thinking about pedagogy suffusing and in dialogue with research. And this seems like it's one step in that direction.
I think along with that, the disruption of the pedagogy and research distinction, I think also disrupting the teacher-student distinction, so that our students are thinking about themselves as pedagogues and thinking about their role in the pedagogical conversation. That to me is huge. I mean, this is not a conversation we should be having in a room without students. Students need to be in the room with us in the discussion of pedagogy.
Well, it's especially true of these collaboratively produced work across disciplines. Sometimes that lowly freshman will be the smartest person in the room about some particular aspect of what you're trying to do.
Yeah.
Or sometimes, you find when you make pedagogy an important component, when you make reflective pedagogy an important component of what you're doing, then you're sharing that kind of pedagogical space with everyone in the classroom, so that it's not strange for you to say, would you three go do this, and she's gonna lead the discussion of Twitter literacy or peer review or whatever. That's what I feel. That's how I feel like. Whenever I feel like a class has succeeded by my own standards, it's because they can teach each other well.
All right, so thanks everybody for a great discussion, and thank you Twitterverse.
Thank you, Twitterverse.
Thank you.
Wherever you are.
Are they up there? Oh, they're right there.
All right.
They were, and this is being streamed.
I know.
For sure.
If you were the first respondent, then you're welcome.
Here it is, here's my command center. This is my Twitter versus Zombies command center. I've got all the major commands, each in their own little search on my tweet deck, so that I can immediately say, oh look, there was a bite at 2 minutes ago, and then there was the spike 4 minutes ago.
So I didn't ask you while we were live, but I mean, how much time do you think the best players spent?
Oh,
A
yeah.
I think that
lot.
There's a thing, there's a response in the reflection document.
Is there?
Yeah,
I think, are we still live? I think Tatiana's response is probably the.
we had that question, let's see, where did we got it? What was the...
So, because one of the pedagogical questions you have to ask yourself is the time and, investment return on the time kind of question.
Because I was.
She says, how much time did you spend playing the games and what complications did that create? Tatiana, I'm guessing, was one of the ones who spent the most time in the game.
Right.
The truth is pretty sad.